A female graduate student preserved her purity, intending to save her perfect self for the boy she had secretly admired for years. Finally, on graduation day, Annie managed to lure the tipsy boy to her room. But at the crucial moment, the girl used the excuse of going to the bathroom to run away, perhaps unable to let go of her inner restraint. Seeing her deep internal conflict, the boy didn't want to hurt her emotionally. Instead, he held her and told her fairy tales all night. To prove that pure friendship could exist between a man and a woman, they agreed to meet every year on July 15th. Although Annie felt this promise was unreliable because opposite genders attract by nature, she firmly believed the boy would eventually fall for her over time. The first July 15th saw Annie move to London to pursue her dream of becoming a writer, while Ike decided to fly to India to enjoy a carefree life. Before leaving, he reminded Annie to write to him, and she smiled foolishly, thinking their growing affection was just a matter of time. But not long after, harsh reality struck her down. Her dream of becoming a writer was unfulfilled, and she had to work at a small restaurant to make ends meet. The boring job and her boss's constant difficulties weighed heavily on her, even dimming the light in her deep eyes. Seeking comfort, she tried calling Ike to pour out her woes about life in London. "London swallowed me whole," she said. But Ike only gave a perfunctory response, as a playboy like him couldn't devote his full attention to one person. "I miss you," she said. But Ike didn't hear her final words. As a rebellious youth, Ike naturally flirted with many girls. His mother wanted to advise him but felt powerless to intervene, watching helplessly as her son turned into a genuine playboy. Time flew by, and the second July 15th arrived. Ike rushed to London to meet Annie, but he started flirting with other girls right in front of her, forcing Annie to leave in anger. Watching her sulk, Ike casually remarked, "We were just kissing." Annie merely grumbled a few words, as life's pressures had already eroded her fighting spirit, leaving her without direction. Seeing his best friend so defeated, Ike couldn't bear it. He wanted Annie to leave the dingy bar and see the outside world. On the third July 15th, Ike took Annie on a spontaneous trip. To maintain their pure friendship, they set some ground rules. "Now have a few beers with me or anyone else," she said. "I never drink beer," Ike replied seriously. They eventually arrived in a small seaside town, and while applying sunscreen, Ike mischievously played tricks on Annie's back. Instead of being annoyed, she seemed to enjoy it, perhaps because deep down she still loved this boy who never grew up. That night they went to a beach bar, and under the influence of alcohol, Annie confessed her secret love to Ike. To her surprise, he smiled knowingly, revealing he had always known her feelings. But as a carefree young master, he couldn't commit to one person. They later went to the water's edge, where Ike impulsively stripped off his clothes and jumped into the water. Encouraged by Ike, Annie decided to be wild for once. Under the moonlight, the atmosphere grew increasingly ambiguous, and Ike finally confessed his feelings. "My thoughts about you and you about me really," Annie asked, touched by his deep confession. Just as she decided to spend her life with Ike, he poured cold water on her hopes, saying, "I think it's unfortunate." Hearing this, Annie could only hide her embarrassment with a smile. At that moment, some children stole Ike's clothes, and he had to chase after them, leaving Annie looking forlorn. That night, they once again passed it uneventfully. A year later, Ike had become a well-known girl, a global host. He became even more indulgent, lost in a life of debauchery. When Annie called to advise him, he brushed her off with a few words and hung up, returning to his carefree nightlife. One day, Ike drove home to visit his seriously ill mother. Her pale face indicated she was nearing the end of her life, bringing tears to Ike's eyes. To make her happy, he turned on the TV to show his achievements. Seeing the scantily clad dancers, his mother was deeply disappointed and turned off the TV, unable to understand why her son had turned out this way. Using exhaustion as an excuse, she asked Ike to help her upstairs to rest. The next morning, she was still sitting by her bed, perhaps her last wish being for her son not to fall into ruin. Despite their meeting, Ike's father was furious, confiscating Ike's sports car and warning him sternly. Perhaps his mother's words had some effect on Ike, and he once again thought of Annie. Annie was just about to leave when the phone rang. It was Ike. Every call from him brought nothing but disappointment, so she decided to end this endless suffering. Meanwhile, Annie also wanted to escape the anxiety and uncertainty, so she accepted a dinner invitation from the chef. Though not famous, Ian was honest and could offer Annie a stable life, so she accepted his proposal. She hoped this new relationship would help her forget Ike, who never grew up. However, even with another man, Annie would still watch Ike's show every night. Seeing Ike being teased by guests on the show, Annie couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness, and Ian, knowing there was always another man in her heart, was understanding. One day, Ian suddenly remarked, maybe in these months of living together, Annie was still trying to make herself like the man in front of her that day. While Ike was rehearsing, a familiar figure appeared. It was his father. Though he appeared stern in front of Ike, he had always silently cared for him. He couldn't believe his son would be as depraved as the rumors said. But seeing the scantily clad dancers and Ike flirting with heavily made-up girls, his father's disappointment was evident. At that moment, Ike didn't notice the tears in his father's eyes, nor did he understand his inner pain. This once dignified father seemed to have lost some of his authority. Before leaving, he left a message for Ike saying, "Did you see what he wrote?" Confused, Ike found the report with evaluations about him. "But you are a prince." Surprised by the screenshots and photos, Ike didn't immediately comprehend. Whenever Ike faced difficulties, he thought of Annie. On the 4th July 15th, they met again in a bar. But this time, Ike was visibly disoriented, frequently visiting the bathroom, showing he had become a junkie. Even on the way back, he couldn't resist teasing Annie. This behavior deeply disappointed Annie, who had come mainly to persuade Ike to get back on track. She couldn't stand seeing him fall deeper into the abyss. But throughout their meeting, Ike behaved like a street thug. Her patience wore thin, and his harsh words, calling her a loser teacher, pushed her to the brink. She angrily left, with Ike chasing after her, trying to apologize with a drink. But Annie decisively left, tired of his excuses. In the following days, Ike realized the depth of his feelings for Annie, who had always been there for him, despite his constant disappointments. But seeing her leave, he knew their relationship was over. After losing Annie, Ike's life turned bleak. His career plummeted, and he was fired. His marriage to a wealthy heiress also failed, as her family looked down on him and often mocked him. Meanwhile, Annie wasn't faring much better. Ian became an alcoholic and increasingly irritable, leading to frequent arguments and an eventual amicable separation. Their relationship had been doomed from the start, as Annie couldn't truly love him. Their paths seemed to have diverged until a friend's wedding brought them back together. Ike spotted Annie wiping her tears and approached her at the end of the dinner. On the rooftop, Annie shared the success of her novel, bringing a smile to her face. Ike was happy for her and handed her a wedding invitation, eagerly inviting her to his wedding. Annie couldn't hold back her tears, feeling both joy and sorrow. Her longtime crush had finally matured, understanding responsibility, but their relationship couldn't progress any further. After their encounter, Annie's career soared, while Ike ended up working at a friend's bar. Though he had a daughter, his wife secretly cheated on him, leading to their divorce. The years passed quickly, and another July 15th arrived. Middle-aged Ike came to London to meet Annie, but they were now worlds apart. Ike, an ordinary worker, and Annie, a renowned writer, faced a wide social gap. Annie's relationship with a pianist added to Ike's inferiority complex. Watching them, he hesitated to approach. Yet, as he walked away by the river, Annie chased after him, and they shared a passionate kiss. That moment, neither wanted to let go. They married and lived a sweet and warm life, though they never had children. One afternoon, Annie was riding her bike home when a car accident took her life. Ike was devastated, becoming a shell of his former self, lost in grief despite having a daughter. His father eventually intervened, sharing his own loss and helping Ike recover. Annie would not have wanted him to continue in despair. Following his father's advice, Ike returned to normal life, opened a restaurant, and reconciled with Ian. Despite their past rivalry, they had both loved the same girl, which eventually brought them together. As Ike tried to keep in touch with Ian, he refused, having moved on to a new family. By July 15, 2011, Ike, now grey-haired, took his daughter to the Hill.